Scientist Naravan Dracovin, Lord Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my discussion on the Pathfinder role-playing game system. When we last left off, we've been talking about magic items. Today, I'm going to introduce you to rods and start talking to you about scrolls. But let's talk about rods. So rods are basically magical metal staffs. Little rods about 2 to 3 feet long, usually made of metal that have magical powers, and, well, anyone can activate it. That's the simplest thing about it. A rod is just a magic staff, magic stick, anybody can activate. Now, as I said, it's about 2 to 3 feet long. It's about 5 pounds. If you're dealing with it combat-wise, it has an AC of 9, hit points of 10, hardness of 10, and a break DC of 27. They're usually made of metal, more often than not iron, though they could be made of really banny metal indeed. Now, if I want to activate a rod, there's nothing standard. Every rod has its own activation listed under the actual rod. More often than not, you're going to need it in your hand, though. Unless it specifically states, assume I'm going to need to be holding on to this rod in order to use it. Now, a rod has a 1% chance of being intelligent. It also has a 30% chance of having some kind of marking on it, which will help hint at what kind of magical powers said rod has. If it has neither of those, it's just blank rod. It may have some kind of decoration on it, but nothing that hints on its actual magical powers that it has. Now, it is important to note that if it's intelligent, it's going to have its own powers and abilities. It's also important to note because sometimes, rarely, rods have charges. Not often, but sometimes they do. If it does have charges, it can't be intelligent. That's the thing to say about the charges. And of course it will mention if it has charges under the rod's description. Now, a bunch of rods are listed in the book, including meta magic rods, which allow you to use meta magic feats on your spells. But you can always look those up and talk about them then. Let's move on though, and let's talk about scrolls. So scrolls, in the most simplest term, are a single spell written on a piece of paper. That's it. It's a single-use scroll-based item, a paper-based item that allows you to cast a single spell. Once I cast a spell, the magical writing vanishes, and it's just a piece of paper. That's it. Gone. Piece of paper. Used it up. Done. But, in the meantime, a scroll will have a price of the spell level times the caster level of the creator that they're using times 25. That's how much money it is to get this scroll that I might want to cast. Now, if there's a material component to the spell that the scroll is casting, I have to include the material component's cost in creating this spell. I have to include the material component cost in buying it from this scroll. So this scroll here, its cost, that formula I gave you, plus material cost added together, that's how much it's going to cost you. Base costs are listed in a chart in the book, based upon the class level and based on the class level and the spell level, and this is again the minimum for the minimum caster level. If I want a scroll that has a higher caster level, guess what? I could theoretically get it, but this is the minimum. That's the base price. You could also make it on your own, of course, too, but that's an entirely different situation. Now, most scrolls are, of course, a sheet of paper of some kind, usually thick reinforced paper, and it will be a 8.5-11 sheet for basically a single spell. It might have leather kind of strips attached to the top and the bottom for easily holding onto. If it has more than one spell on the scroll, it will extend longer. It'll keep the same width, 8.5, but it'll be longer than 11 inches. Now, if it should get to 3 or more spells, oftentimes those leather strips are replaced by metal reinforcement bars. Basically make it a little easier to hold that entire thing apart because you're going to be unfurling it pretty long with that many spells. This is important to note that it will have an AC of 9, hit points of 1, hardness of 0, and a break DC of 8. It's pretty easy just to snap a scroll in half. Now, scrolls, when they are kept, are oftentimes curled up for easier keeping, curled up on either end. It also makes it easier to pull it out because you're pulling it out from both ends. They will oftentimes have some kind of scroll case in order to save the spell and keep the scroll and keep it in good condition. Scroll cases oftentimes have markings on it that are there to allow the basically holder of said spell understand which spell is in there. I can look at my scroll cases and be like, oh, this is my fireball spell, this is my lightning bolt spell. You know, I would recognize the symbols on them quickly and efficiently and be able to choose the correct one. It is also important to note that the reason there might be symbols here is magical traps. If I want to put some kind of magical trap within these symbols here that someone could check it and read it and get blown up by it, guess what? That's where I'd hide it. Now, let's talk about using a scroll, because it's going to require a big number of steps, which we're going to go over most of today and finish the rest of up next time, because I said, huge number of steps. They seem simple. They really are simple, but we have to talk about each of them individually. First off, I got to be able to read this scroll. It's got kind of arcane writing on it. I have to understand what it says in order to cast it. Now, of course, I could cast Read Magic and be like, I can read this just fine. Or I could attempt to decipher it using a spellcraft check DC 20 plus the spell level of the spell on this scroll. It takes a full round action to attempt to decipher it. The thing about this is when I decipher it, I can choose to start casting the spell or not. I can have that option of not casting spell when I'm deciphering it. Basically, I'm reading it, not casting it. Now, the advantage of this is I could decipher it ahead of time. The Read Magic doesn't help me because it's just a magical go-around. But if I wanted to decipher it ahead of time and be able to be like quickly in battle, read it, then I could do that. I could easily decipher it and get set up that when I'm getting into battle, I could be like, don't have to decipher, don't have to take that full round action, I'm ready for it. Now, we activate the scroll. We deciphered the script. It's time to actually activate the scroll. This will traditionally be a standard action, though if the spell itself has a longer casting time, then that's how long it's going to take. It's exactly like casting a spell. There are some exceptions. I'm not going to need the materials. I'm not going to need the focus. Those were made with the scroll. Those were things that were added in when the scroll was created. The material components, any kind of focuses. I'm going to have to do some gestures and say some words, and I'm going to treat it exactly like I'm casting a spell. It requires the same level of concentration. I can be distracted just the same. And of course, arcane spell failure would apply also just like with casting a spell. So in a lot of ways, I'm casting a spell from this scroll. The scroll will need the appropriate target. Targets aren't provided for your scroll. I'm going to have an appropriate material. If I am casting like a stone shape, I'm going to need stone to deal with. I just can't cast a spell and things happen. The actual target of the spell has to be provided. Whether it's a person, creature, or object, I have to have it ready. Now, there are a couple of requirements you need to activate the scroll. Oh yeah, you have to meet a few requirements to successfully do this. First off, is it a divine scroll or is it an arcane scroll? If you are a divine caster, you can only use divine scrolls. If you're an arcane caster, you can only use arcane scrolls. Ah, so the scroll magic type has to match you. Next off, it has to be on your spell list. Oh, that means me, as a bard, could only cast spells that would be on the bard list, and has to be arcane. This means, of course, I could cast a scroll created by a wizard, if it's on my list, but I couldn't cast one created by a cleric, even if it's on my list, because again, it's divine then. Ah, so it doesn't matter what class created it, it matters if it's arcane, divine, and if it's on your list. Then you need the appropriate ability score to cast it. There you go. So if it's a scroll a wizard would have, you need enough intelligence. If it's one a bard would have, you need enough charisma. Ooh. So we see the requirements are getting more difficult to cast. Now your caster level has to be equal to or greater than the caster level required to cast the spell on the scroll. That means if it's a third level spell, you at least have to be 5th level caster or higher. Then you automatically cast it. If you are lower caster level, basically I'm 5th level and I'm trying to cast a 4th level spell, I need to make a caster level check of the caster level of the said scroll +1. Not the minimum caster level, the actual caster level of the scroll. Because, as I said before, you can have caster levels higher than there. But you basically have to match the caster level of the scroll, or make a check and hope for the best. Now, if I fail that check, then I have to make a wisdom check DC 5. If I succeed at that, I'm fine. If I fail, I have a mishap. If I roll a 1, I automatically have a mishap, no chance to avoid it. We'll talk about mishaps next time. Also, it is important to note that using a scroll, just like casting a spell, provokes an attack of opportunity unless you do it defensively and unless you're concentrating. These are options you can do in order to avoid that attack of opportunity because it's just like casting a spell. Exactly like casting a spell. And that's it for today. I talked about rods. Magical sticks that anybody can use that have a variety of different powers, might have charges, have different activations based upon the rod, and basically you can get one and use its abilities if you want to and if you can. Then I talked about scrolls. At least I started talking about them. I talked about the basics of what a scroll is. Sheet of paper, spell, one or more spells on it that you might have to roll out to great length, especially depending on if it has a lot of spells on it. And of course, then I talked about using it. You have to be able to read it. You have to be able to activate it. And activating it requires a bunch of requirements to be able to meet. But if you meet the requirements, and if you've read it, guess what? You can cast it. And when you cast it, it's just like casting a spell. You treat it exactly like casting a spell. In the next episode, we're going to talk about those mishaps you might have and the finishing, talking about scrolls in general, and we'll move on to talking about staffs and hopefully wands. But if you have any questions, comments, anything you would say, anything you think I left out, please leave it in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe. It's your support for the channel, the Empire, the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon, link in the description below. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.